The room was silent except for the sound of ice melting in crystal glasses. 7 men sat around a mahogany table in the back room of a brownstone on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. The year was 1947. Outside, the city hummed with post-war optimism. Inside, the air tasted like cigar smoke and fear. Meyer Lansky sat at the head of the table, not because he demanded it, because no one else would dare take that seat. His gray suit was perfectly pressed, his tie straight. His eyes moved slowly across each face, reading them the way accountants read ledgers. Next to him, closer than anyone else, sat a man whose name most people have never heard. History forgot him on purpose, but the men in that room would never forget. He was known simply as Doc, not a real doctor, just a man who diagnosed problems and prescribed solutions, permanent solutions. Doc had been with Lansky since the beginning, through the bootlegging wars, through the formation of the commission, through the reorganization of organized crime into something that looked almost respectable from the outside. While Lansky calculated numbers, Doc calculated risks. While Lansky built financial empires, Doc removed obstacles. They were two halves of the same machine, and on that particular evening in 1947, that machine was about to make a decision that would echo through decades. The problem sitting across the table wore an expensive suit but cheap cologne. His name was Tommy Martino, mid-level operator, connected to 3 families, trusted by none. He had been skimming, not much, just enough to think he could get away with it, just enough to believe he was smarter than the system Meyer Lansky had built. The evidence was irrefutable. Ledgers did not lie. Numbers told stories that words could not hide, and the story Tommy Martino's numbers told was one of betrayal. But this meeting was not about Tommy Martino. Not really. It was about something bigger. It was about establishing a precedent, about showing the entire underworld that the new order had rules, and that those rules applied to everyone, no matter how connected, no matter how useful they had been in the past. If stories like this make you see Meyer Lansky and the world he built in a different light, then this channel was made for you. Subscribe now, because there is much more to this story that few people know. And what happened next in that room changed everything. Lansky had not spoken yet. He rarely did at the beginning of these meetings. He let silence do the work. Let men fill that silence with their own guilt and paranoia. Tommy tried to look confident, but his fingers tapped the table. Once, twice. A nervous rhythm that everyone noticed. Everyone except Tommy himself. The other men at the table were witnesses. Carefully selected witnesses. Representatives from different families, different territories, different philosophies of how business should be conducted. They were there to see justice, or what passed for justice in a world without courts or appeals. Charlie Luciano would have been there if he had not been deported. Frank Costello sent a proxy. Albert Anastasia sat stone-faced in the corner, his reputation for violence preceding him into every room he entered. But this was Meyer's show, and Doc was his stage manager. Lansky finally spoke. His voice was soft, almost gentle, the kind of voice a grandfather might use to explain something to a child. He did not raise it. He never needed to. When Meyer Lansky spoke quietly, men leaned in. When he whispered, they held their breath. He laid out the case, numbers, dates, amounts. He did not accuse. He simply presented facts. This much was missing from this account. This transaction did not match the books. This payment never reached its destination. He spoke for maybe 3 minutes. It felt like 3 hours. Each word was a nail, each sentence a hammer blow. By the time Lansky finished, Tommy Martino's face had gone from red to white to gray. Tommy opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. The excuse died on his lips. You could not argue with numbers. You could not negotiate with mathematics. And you certainly could not lie to Meyer Lansky about money. That was his language, his religion, his art form. The question was not whether Tommy was guilty. Everyone in the room knew he was. The question was what came next. In the old days, before Lansky and Luciano reorganized everything, This would have been simple. Someone would pull out a gun, blood would stain the carpet, the body would disappear into the East River. Quick, brutal, final. But Lansky had built something different, something that looked like civilization. There were procedures now, processes. The commission had to agree, territories had to be respected. Alliances had to be maintained. One wrong move could start a war. One emotional decision could cost millions. So they developed a language, a system of gestures and signals that meant more than words ever could. Lansky turned his head, just slightly, just enough. His eyes found Doc, and something passed between them. Decades of partnership, hundreds of decisions, thousands of conversations reduced to a single glance. The entire room watched, waiting. The ice in the glasses continued melting. The city outside continued breathing. But inside that room, time stopped. Doc leaned forward, not much. Maybe 6 inches, maybe less. His movement was so subtle that if you blinked, you might have missed it. He looked at Tommy Martino, then at Lansky, then back at Tommy. And then he did it. The gesture that would define everything that followed. A nod. One single downward movement of his head, almost imperceptible, accompanied by a sound, not a word, not a sentence, just a whisper, a breath, an exhalation that carried more weight than a judge's gavel, more finality than a death certificate. That sound lasted maybe half a second. But in that half second, Tommy Martino's fate was sealed. The message was sent, the decision was made, and everyone in the room understood exactly what it meant. Understanding what happened next requires understanding who Doc really was. His real name was Hyman Abrams, but no one had called him that since 1923. He earned the nickname Doc during Prohibition, not because he healed people, because he was surgical in his precision. When Doc handled a problem, there were no loose ends, no witnesses, no evidence, no mess. He made things clean, professional, almost medical in execution. Doc grew up on the Lower East Side, same neighborhood as Lansky. Different street, same poverty, same desperation. Same understanding that the American dream came with fine print, that people like them were not supposed to read. They met as teenagers. Lansky was running small-time gambling operations. Doc was providing security. They recognized something in each other. A mutual understanding of how the world actually worked versus how it pretended to work. While Meyer had a gift for numbers, Doc had a gift for reading people. He could walk into a room and know within 30 seconds who was loyal, who was weak, who was dangerous, and who was already dead but did not know it yet. This was not intuition. It was studied observation. Doc watched how people held their hands, how they positioned their feet, where their eyes went when they lied. He understood body language before psychologists had a name for it. During the bootlegging wars of the 20s, while Lansky built the financial infrastructure, Doc built the operational one. He recruited drivers, bribed cops, established routes, eliminated competition, not through dramatic shootouts, through quiet disappearances. One day a rival bootlegger would be causing problems. The next day he simply was not. No one asked questions. No one needed to. But Doc's real value was not violence. Anyone could pull a trigger. His value was judgment. Lansky trusted Doc's instincts completely. If Doc said someone was reliable, they were reliable. If Doc said someone was a risk, they were a risk. And if Doc said someone had to go, they went. No second opinions, no appeals. Doc had earned that level of trust through 15 years of never being wrong. The relationship between them was strange to outsiders. They were not friends in any traditional sense. They did not socialize, did not share meals unless business required it, did not talk about personal matters. But they were connected in a way that transcended friendship. They were partners in building something that had never existed before. A criminal enterprise that operated like a corporation, with rules, standards, accountability. That is why the moment in the brownstone carried so much weight. When Doc gave that nod and whispered that sound, he was not just condemning Tommy Martino. He was confirming that the system worked, that the rules applied equally, That merit and mathematics mattered more than connections and history. In the old days, Tommy might have survived because his uncle knew the right people. But this was the new era, the Lansky era. And in this era, the numbers always won. The whisper itself was deliberate. Doc could have spoken clearly, could have said yes or no, could have explained his reasoning, but that would have been inefficient, unnecessary. The men in that room did not need explanations. They needed signals. And Doc's whisper was the clearest signal possible. It said Tommy had been evaluated. The evidence had been weighed. The decision had been reached, and now it would be executed. Have you ever been in a room where everyone understood something without speaking it? Where the real conversation happened in silence? What made Doc so effective was his lack of ego. He never sought recognition, never tried to build his own empire, never challenged Lansky's authority. He understood his role and performed it perfectly. While other men in the organization jockeyed for position and status, Doc remained in the shadows. Not because he was weak, because shadows were where the real work happened. Lansky knew this, knew that Doc's loyalty was absolute not because of fear or obligation, but because they shared a vision. A world where organized crime was actually organized, where decisions were based on logic rather than emotion, where business principles replaced the chaos of gang warfare. Doc believed in that vision as deeply as Lansky did, maybe more. Because Doc had seen what happened when emotions ruled. He had cleaned up those messes, had removed the bodies, had watched promising operations collapse because someone made a decision based on pride instead of profit. So when he leaned forward in that brownstone room and gave his nod, accompanied by that whispered breath, he was not being cruel. He was not being cold. He was being consistent. Tommy Martino had violated the rules that kept everyone safe. That prevented wars. That allowed business to flourish. Personal feelings were irrelevant. Doc might have liked Tommy, might have shared drinks with him, might have respected his courage in the old bootlegging days. None of that mattered. The numbers told a story, and in Lansky's world, the story the numbers told was the only truth that existed. The other men in the room understood this immediately. That is why no one objected, no one asked for mercy, no one suggested an alternative. They had all agreed to live by these rules. They had all benefited from the stability these rules created, and now those rules were being enforced. It was impersonal, in the same way gravity is impersonal. It simply was. Tommy understood, too. You could see it in his eyes, the exact moment the reality penetrated. When the whisper reached his ears and his brain processed what it meant, his shoulders slumped. Not dramatically, just a slight settling. Like a building accepting its foundation has cracked. He did not beg. To his credit, he did not cry or make threats or try to negotiate. He knew the math. He knew the system. He had just believed he was smart enough to beat it. He had been wrong. Lansky stood up, slowly, carefully. He straightened his suit jacket, adjusted his cufflinks. Small rituals that signaled the meeting was over. The decision had been made. There was nothing left to discuss. He walked past Tommy without looking at him. Not out of disrespect, out of completion. Tommy was already gone, already erased from the ledger. Looking at him would have been like looking at empty air. Doc remained seated. He would handle the details. He always did. The other men filed out one by one, each of them understanding that they had witnessed something important. Not the fate of Tommy Martino. That was incidental. They had witnessed the consolidation of a new order. Proof that the system Lansky and Doc had built was real, was functional, would be enforced. The execution happened 3 days later. Not in a dramatic fashion, not with gunfire or struggle. Tommy Martino simply disappeared. He left his apartment in the morning, never came home. His car was found parked near the docks, empty, keys still in the ignition, no blood, no signs of violence. Just absence. The kind of clean, professional absence that Doc specialized in. But the execution was not the story. The story was what happened in those 3 days between the nod and the disappearance. Because in that time, word spread. Not through newspapers or police reports, through whispers. Different whispers than Doc's, whispers in back rooms and corner booths, whispers in social clubs and betting parlors. The message was simple and arrived everywhere simultaneously. The commission had made a ruling. The rules were real. No one was exempt. This was the real power of Doc's whisper. It was not just a death sentence for one man. It was a message to thousands. Every small-time operator who thought about skimming. Every mid-level manager who considered going independent. Every ambitious lieutenant who dreamed of building his own empire. They all heard that whisper, not literally, but they felt its implications. They understood that the old days were gone. That chaos had been replaced by order, and that order had teeth. Lansky designed it this way. He understood that power was not about how many men you could kill. It was about how few you needed to kill to send the right message. One carefully chosen example was worth 100 random acts of violence. It was efficient, economical, mathematical. Everything Lansky did was mathematical. Doc's whisper became legend. Not because it was loud, because it was quiet. In a world where men shouted and threatened and pounded tables, that tiny sound carried more weight than any scream. It proved that real power does not announce itself. It simply is, and everyone recognizes it instinctively. The technique itself was brilliant. By making the signal so subtle, so small, so easy to miss if you were not paying absolute attention, Doc and Lansky created a test. Were you important enough to be in the room? Were you sharp enough to catch the signal? Were you connected enough to understand its meaning? The whisper separated insiders from outsiders, players from spectators, those who mattered from those who only thought they did. Other organizations tried to copy it. Families in Chicago and Detroit and Philadelphia attempted to create their own systems of signals and whispers, but they missed the essential element. The whisper only worked because of the relationship between Lansky and Doc, because of the absolute trust, because everyone knew Doc's judgment was sound and Lansky's backing was total. Without that foundation, a whisper was just a whisper. Meaningless air. This is power. Not the ability to destroy, but the ability to decide with absolute finality. To have your judgment trusted so completely that a nod becomes law. The commission meeting that followed 2 weeks later confirmed everything. Representatives from all the major families gathered. Neutral territory, maximum security. The usual business was discussed. Territory disputes, profit sharing, police problems. But everyone knew the real topic was Tommy Martino. Not his fate, that was already decided, but what his fate meant for everyone else. Lansky did not need to defend the decision. No one questioned it. Instead, the meeting became a validation. Family after family acknowledged that the system worked. That having clear rules and consistent enforcement was better than the alternative. Better than the gang wars of the 20s that had killed so many and accomplished so little. Tommy Martino had stolen. He had been caught. He had been punished. Simple, clean, just. But there was another element, one that took years to fully understand. By making Doc the one who gave the signal, Lansky protected himself. Not legally, those distinctions were meaningless in their world, but politically. If someone wanted to challenge the decision, they would have to challenge Doc. And challenging Doc meant challenging his judgment, which meant challenging his value to the organization, which meant challenging the entire system. It was insulation, brilliant insulation. Lansky remained above the violence. He was the architect, the mathematician, the businessman. Doc was the implementer, the enforcer, the one who made the hard decisions that kept the machine running. They both benefited. The organization benefited. Everyone benefited, except those who broke the rules. Tommy Martino's disappearance sent ripples through the underworld for months, but not the kind you might expect. There was no revenge plot, no family seeking retribution, no calls for justice or explanations, because everyone understood. Tommy had been given every chance. He had access to the best criminal organization in the country, had opportunities for legitimate wealth, had protection and connections. And he had thrown it away for pocket change and ego. His fate was not tragic, it was predictable, mathematical. Doc never spoke about it, not to justify it, not to explain it, not even to confirm it. That was not his way. He moved on to the next problem, the next decision, the next whisper when needed. Because in the world he and Lansky had built, sentiment was a luxury they could not afford. Efficiency was everything, and Doc was nothing if not efficient. The brownstone on the Upper East Side continued hosting meetings. Different problems, different faces, different decisions. But they all followed the same pattern. Lansky would present the facts, the evidence, the numbers. Doc would observe, evaluate. And when the moment came, when the decision point arrived, he would lean forward, give his nod, whisper his judgment, and the machinery would move forward, inevitable, impersonal, absolute. The impact of that whisper extended far beyond Tommy Martino's fate. It established a template, a methodology, a way of operating that would define organized crime for the next 3 decades. Before that moment, criminal organizations ran on personality and violence. After that moment, they ran on procedure and precision. Other members of Lansky's organization took note. If Doc said yes, it meant yes. If Doc said no, it meant no. There was no appealing to emotion, no calling in favors, no negotiating. You either followed the rules or you faced the consequences. This created something unprecedented in the criminal underworld: reliability. Partners knew what to expect. Associates understood the boundaries. Everyone operated with a clear understanding of cause and effect. This reliability attracted a different kind of person to the organization. Not the hotheads and cowboys who dominated earlier eras, but strategists, planners, people who could think 3 moves ahead. Who understood that sustainable profit required sustainable operations. That getting rich slowly was better than getting rich quick and ending up dead. Lansky's organization became the preferred destination for anyone who wanted to build something lasting. The financial implications were staggering. With clear rules and consistent enforcement, Lansky could expand into territories that had been impossible before. He could make deals with other organizations knowing they would be honored. Could invest in long-term operations knowing they would not be disrupted by internal chaos. Could build legitimate business fronts knowing they would not be compromised by someone's impulsive violence. The casinos came next, first in Florida, then in Cuba. Eventually Las Vegas, each one built on the foundation that Doc's whisper had helped establish: rules, systems, accountability. The casino business required trust from legitimate investors, required loans from regular banks, required relationships with politicians and police. None of that was possible in the old chaos. All of it became possible in the new order. Doc remained essential throughout this expansion. Not as a manager or administrator, as a guarantor. His reputation preceded every new venture. Partners knew that if they violated agreements, Doc would handle it. Efficiently, quietly, finally. This was better than contracts and lawyers, faster than courts and appeals, and absolutely certain in its outcomes. But there was a cost. The same precision that made the organization successful made it inflexible. There was no room for mistakes. No tolerance for weakness, no second chances. This created a culture of paranoia. Everyone watched everyone, counted everything, reported anything unusual, not out of loyalty, but out of self-preservation, because no one wanted to be the next person sitting across from Lansky while Doc leaned forward. The psychological toll was real. Men who worked in that environment developed ulcers, had heart attacks, aged prematurely. The stress of constant accountability, of knowing that one mistake could mean disappearing into the East River, wore people down. Some left, found other work, other cities, other lives. Those who stayed either thrived in that pressure or were destroyed by it. Doc himself seemed immune to this stress. Maybe because he never made mistakes, or maybe because he understood that emotions were inefficient. He ate regularly, slept soundly, took vacations, lived a remarkably normal life outside of work. He had a wife who knew nothing about his business, had children who thought he worked in imports, had neighbors who considered him quiet but friendly. This separation was complete. When Doc left the brownstone, he left that world behind until the next meeting, the next problem, the next whisper. Lansky appreciated this quality, the ability to compartmentalize, to be ruthless when necessary and ordinary the rest of the time. It made Doc sustainable, reliable, not prone to the burnout or breakdown that affected so many others. Doc could give the order to end someone's life and then go home and help his daughter with her homework. Not because he was a sociopath, because he understood that business was business and life was life, and mixing the two destroyed both. The organization continued growing, new cities, new operations, new partners. But the core remained the same. Lansky at the top, calculating profit and risk. Doc at his side, evaluating people and problems. The whisper became less frequent as the years passed. Not because it was no longer effective, because fewer people needed to hear it. The lesson had been learned. The rules were understood. The system was self-enforcing. By the 1950s, the transformation was complete. What had been a collection of street gangs had become a sophisticated business network. What had operated on violence and fear now operated on profit margins and market analysis. What had been chaos had become order. And at the center of that order, rarely mentioned in newspapers or history books, was a man called Doc, whose whisper had helped build an empire. Law enforcement never understood this. They looked for the boss, the big personality, the public figure. They assumed power had to announce itself, had to be visible and dramatic. So they focused on the wrong people, chased the wrong targets, built cases around the wrong theories. Meanwhile, the real power sat quietly in back rooms, nodding subtly, whispering judgments that shaped destinies. The FBI files on Meyer Lansky ran thousands of pages. The files on Doc were nearly empty, not because he was careful, though he was, because investigators did not understand what they were looking at. To them, Doc was just an associate, a minor figure, someone who stood in the background of photographs. They never realized that the background was where decisions were made. That influence did not require a title. That power could be silent and still be absolute. The end came quietly, as everything involving Doc did. In 1963, he died of a heart attack, at home, in his sleep, peaceful, no drama, no violence, just a life that ended the way most lives do, natural, unremarkable. Except his life had been anything but unremarkable. His funeral was small, family only. No representatives from the organization, no acknowledgement of who he had been or what he had done. By design, Doc had insisted. Even in death, he remained in the shadows. Lansky attended privately, paid his respects to Doc's widow, said nothing about their partnership, nothing about the decades of decisions, nothing about the whisper that had changed everything. He simply shook her hand, offered condolences, left. The world would never know what they had built together. And that was exactly how both men wanted it. The organization continued without Doc. Other men stepped into similar roles. But it was never quite the same, because you cannot replace decades of trust, cannot replicate the kind of judgment that comes from knowing someone completely. The new enforcers were competent, professional, but they lacked Doc's instinct, his ability to see 3 steps ahead, his surgical precision in removing problems before they became disasters. Lansky felt the absence acutely. Not emotionally, he was too disciplined for that, but practically. Decisions took longer, required more discussion, more confirmation, more second-guessing. The efficiency they had built together degraded slowly but inevitably. Other organizations sensed this, tested boundaries, pushed limits. The order began fracturing at the edges. By the 1970s, the world they had created was unraveling. New players emerged who did not respect the old rules, did not understand the value of restraint, saw violence as a tool rather than a last resort. The drug trade accelerated this breakdown. Cocaine and heroin brought different kinds of criminals. Younger, more reckless, motivated by different incentives. The mathematical precision Lansky had imposed gave way to the chaos he had spent his life trying to eliminate. Lansky himself died in 1983. Natural causes, surrounded by family. His fortune, rumored to be in the hundreds of millions, was never found. The IRS searched, the FBI investigated, journalists speculated. But the money had vanished into the systems Lansky had spent his life building. Offshore accounts, legitimate businesses, investment vehicles that looked completely legal. The numbers, his first love and last defense, protected him even in death. But his real legacy was not money. It was method. The system he and Doc created influenced organized crime long after both men were gone. The idea that criminal enterprises could operate like corporations, that rules and procedures were more effective than violence and intimidation. That power could be quiet and still be absolute. These concepts spread through every major criminal organization in America and beyond. The whisper itself became mythology. Old-timers told stories about it. Younger generations half believed them. Was it real? Did it actually happen? Or was it just a legend, a story told to illustrate a principle? The truth became irrelevant. The lesson remained. Pay attention to small signals. Understand that the most important decisions are often the quietest. Respect systems over personalities. Follow the rules or face the consequences. Modern organized crime operates on these principles whether they know their origin or not. The days of flashy gangsters and public violence have largely passed, replaced by quiet coordination and financial sophistication, by men who look like accountants and businessmen, who make their decisions in conference rooms rather than back alleys, who understand that real power does not announce itself. This is the world Doc and Lansky built, not through grand gestures or public declarations, through 1,000 small moments, 1,000 careful decisions, 1,000 whispers that added up to a revolution in how criminal enterprises operated. The brownstone meetings, the subtle nods, the measured judgments, each one a brick in a structure that still stands decades later. When you think about power, what do you imagine? Loud voices, dramatic gestures, or something quieter, something that moves beneath the surface and changes everything? The lesson extends beyond organized crime. It applies to any organization, any system, any structure where decisions must be made and enforced. Clarity is more valuable than passion. Consistency is more powerful than intensity. Systems outlast personalities. Rules provide freedom by defining boundaries. These truths were as relevant in the boardroom as in the backroom, as applicable to corporations as to criminal syndicates. Meyer Lansky understood this intuitively. Doc embodied it completely. Together they proved that revolution does not require loud proclamations. Change does not need grand announcements. Sometimes the most significant moments in history are the quietest. A nod, a whisper, a breath of air that somehow carries the weight of destiny. The recording of that moment does not exist. No photographs captured it, no witness wrote it down, but everyone who was there remembered. And they told others. And those others told more. Until the story spread through the underworld like doctrine, like scripture. Not because it was dramatic, because it was true. Because it represented something fundamental about how power actually works. In the decades since, countless decisions have been made in similar fashion. In boardrooms and war rooms, in government offices and corporate headquarters, small signals that carry enormous weight, subtle gestures that determine outcomes, quiet moments that change trajectories. We see it in jury rooms when a foreman nods, in negotiations when a representative leans forward, in meetings when a leader pauses just a moment too long before speaking. Doc's whisper was not unique because of what it was. It was significant because of what it represented. The triumph of system over chaos, of precision over violence, of intelligence over emotion. It proved that power could be sophisticated, that authority could be earned through judgment rather than force, that respect came from consistency rather than fear. This is what people miss when they romanticize the old gangster era. They see the surface, the violence and drama, the personalities and conflicts. They miss the revolution happening underneath, the transformation from gang to enterprise, from chaos to order, from emotional reactions to strategic decisions. Doc and Lansky were not just criminals. They were architects, building something that would outlast them, creating systems that would persist long after their names were forgotten, and their names were largely forgotten, as they intended. History remembers Lucky Luciano, Al Capone, Bugsy Siegel, the loud ones, the flashy ones, the ones who died dramatically. But the real power, the enduring influence, belonged to the quiet ones, the patient ones, the ones who understood that being remembered was less important than being effective. In the end, that is the real story of Doc's Whisper. Not that it condemned one man, but that it established a principle, that it proved a theory, that it demonstrated a better way of operating. Meyer Lansky had many innovations, many brilliant strategies, many successful ventures, but perhaps his greatest achievement was creating a partnership where a whisper could carry the weight of law, where a nod could mean finality, where silence spoke louder than threats. The world has changed enormously since that evening in 1947. Technology has transformed everything. Society has evolved. Laws have tightened. But human nature remains constant. The need for order, the desire for justice, the recognition that systems work better than chaos. These truths persist. And in quiet rooms across the world, in moments when critical decisions must be made, people still lean forward, still give their nods, still whisper their judgments. Doc's legacy is not in the lives he ended. It is in the system he helped build, in the proof that intelligence triumphs over violence, that precision beats passion, that quiet power is the strongest power of all. He and Lansky showed that criminal enterprises could be civilized, could be organized, could be sustainable, not through weakness or compromise, but through discipline and structure. This was the real revolution, not a transfer of power from one boss to another, but a transformation in how power itself operated, from loud to quiet, from emotional to analytical, from chaotic to systematic, from temporary to permanent. The whisper was not just a death sentence, it was a declaration. An announcement that the old ways were finished, that a new era had begun, that from this moment forward, business would be conducted differently. And it was. For decades, the system worked exactly as designed, providing stability, generating profit, preventing wars, creating opportunity. All because two men understood something that most people miss, that real power does not need to shout, real authority does not need to threaten, real influence does not need to advertise itself. It simply exists, quiet, certain, absolute, like a whisper in a silent room that somehow echoes through history.